returning to the topic of jobs, and although it's not explicit on the agenda, jobs in communities, one of the wonderful things that's emerged over the past half a decade, or a little more than that actually, in the context of the work on carbon capture, especially at the federal level, is this terrific partnership involving organized labor and the various industries involved and environmental advocates and others working together. One of the reasons for that is that carbon capture offers, as a technology, offers the opportunity to manage CO2 emissions from power generation and industrial processes in those places and in those communities where those facilities or the energy production exists. And if you think about the broader conversation on energy and climate, it often has the flavor of transitioning away from resources and communities to something different. The challenge there is that communities aren't migratory, and a lot of jobs don't move either. And so that's something I think is for the late. I don't want to get ahead of our guests who will be speaking, but I think that's one of the things that's really drawn organized labor as a partner into this effort in a way that's been extraordinarily beneficial to moving policy. So we're excited about the panel we're having today, and I want to welcome Al Ekblad, who is the Secretary of the Montana AFL-CIO, and Roxanne Brown of the Steelworkers, and Chauffeur Shermer of the local for the utility workers right here in Wyoming. And I'll introduce Al, and Al will introduce our other two speakers. Al has been a long-standing labor leader in Montana. I found out about Al because of his efforts in working with the labor community, but also other stakeholders in Montana to try and find a solution for sustaining the Colstrip power plant in Montana, which is a power plant that has 4 units. And there's a considerable effort underway in Montana to find a way to preserve units 3 and 4 by retrofitting them with carbon capture technology. And I'll let Al talk about that, but that conversation in Montana has gotten national attention, involvement of DOE, involvement of folks in this room, and the interest, of course, of Governor Bullock. And so Al has a very interesting perspective not only on that effort, but also what it means for his members and the communities they live in. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Al, who will have his remarks and moderate the panel and introduce our other guests. Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Brad. Folks, I'm a misplaced Minnesotan that ended up in Montana 40 years ago. It's the greatest thing that ever happened in my life. If you don't know where Montana is, it's that really big expanse. I think that's north. Hell, I don't know. That's between here and Canada. So I'm going to talk about a community. And although specifically it's about Colstrip, it's really about my state. So in Montana, if you were to go to Wikipedia and look up the 4 best communities by medium wage to live in, number 1 would be Colstrip. Number 2 and 3 would be Glasgow, which has some oil, Sydney, Glendive. And then the 5th one is Three Forks, which has a talc mine and a processing plant. Those are the blue-collar jobs. And that is a big factor in driving our state. Of course, there are other economic drivers. Tourism is growing, outdoor sports is growing. But at the heart of what we do in Montana, our history has been tied around our resources and the ability to utilize those resources to create good blue-collar jobs. And during the break, I asked folks, some of Brad's folks, to put out 5 pictures that are in the center of your table. They're each different. That is, the top one is the plant at Colstrip. The second one is the view across the lake at Colstrip to look at the plant. The third one is a medical facility. The fourth one's the city pool. And the fifth one is the one I really love. It is the golf course. And if you see the coal trees behind it, the reason I love that is there's a great story about Colstrip. Colstrip produces the best young golfers in the state of Montana. And they do that because every child of every blue-collar worker in that community can go golf for free. There was a story just a week ago about a young man leaving Colstrip to go to college on a golfing scholarship. He was leaving Colstrip. It was a different path. But that doesn't happen without coal. And I want you to look long and hard at those pictures, because that community disappears if coal generation ends in this country. There are 800 direct jobs between the plant and the mine. The community has 2,300 people there. From our perspective as a state federation, we represent not only the miners and the plant operators, we represent every public employee in that community. It's the most union town in the state. We need to find ways to keep our good communities that are supported by blue-collar jobs operating. Now, there's a lot of discussion throughout the day about the economics of carbon capture. There's been questions about policy. I would raise the question is, what economy do we want for this country and for our communities? Because, and I don't have the opportunity to address a group like this on a regular basis. I engage with a lot of folks from the environmental community. And I hear conversations, number one, they wanted to sell just transition. Just transition is not leaving a job that pays over $100,000 a year in rural Montana, that gives you a full pension to retire, and gives you medical benefits for your whole family, to a job where you make half of that. In most cases in Montana, won't have a retirement, and you sure won't have a pension, or you'll have health care for yourself and have to buy it for your family members. Our country can't afford to keep losing these jobs. And I would argue that we've also talked about policy. Politics, as we all in this room know, drive policy. And I would argue that the disenfranchised workers and the disenfranchised retirees from the blue-collar communities across this country are doing more to drive policy right now than all of us in this room. And we can't let that continue to happen. We need to re-engage those people. We need to provide an economy that is fair. That is the reason that I became involved in the labor movement. From my perspective of why am I here, obviously I represent a whole universe of workers that are impacted by this. But one of my colleagues that I've worked with heard it while standing in the lunch line, somebody in the room talking to somebody else saying, well, I'm glad that labor's engaged in this. And maybe we haven't been in this room with you. But I entered this universe of discussion around carbon capture over 4 years ago. And I can guarantee that the folks that are sitting here in the room with me, their unions were there long before I got there. And quite honestly, we were engaged around the Clean Power Plan. It actually gave us a framework that we could work towards. Didn't like all of it. In fact, when it finally came out, and I think Montana had the highest reduction requirement in the nation, we didn't like it a lot. But we had a framework that we could work through. And I would argue today, we have no idea where this is going. and we need to figure out what we're going to do in this country to change that. I've learned so much here today, and I appreciate the presenters. I appreciate the sponsors for bringing all of us together, and Brad, for inviting me to participate. That's really the heart of my comments. I'm going to add a couple of last things. The average age in Colstrip is not a bunch of old miners and old plant operators. It's 38. It's a family town. The average income is over $60,000 a year. We can't lose that kind of income and change it out and expect our communities to survive. It is critical to that community that you see pictures of. It's critical to the kids in the pool. That town was developed because the Great Northern Railroad needed coal. It's there today because it's a mine-mouth operation. And I hear talk, as I said earlier, about just transition and economic diversification. I'm not optimistic about economic diversification if it's not related to coal, to a community that's 130 miles from anywhere. And I'll close with, you cannot, it is not the end of the world, but if you get up on a high hill outside of Colstrip, you will see it. This is what we're dealing with. These jobs have given rural communities the ability to be middle-class communities. There isn't anything in the pipeline that I see going forward or coming forward that is going to change that. We need to work together to figure out how to move this policy and embrace workers and the value of a good paying job. The next speaker is Roxanne Brown. She's the legislative director for the United Steelworkers Union. And as I said, they were in this conversation when I showed up 4.5 years ago. She has personally been involved on an international level dealing with this issue. She sits on the steering committee for the Blue-Green Alliance, which I think many of you in the room are familiar with. If you're not, it's a joint labor and environmental community effort to address clean energy. So I'm going to turn it over to Roxanne. It's up to you.
Thanks, Al. And good afternoon. And thank you for the intro, Al, and thank you, Brad and team, for inviting me and us to be here. And I take the comment that the person made in line about, they're glad that labor is a part of this conversation. I take that comment very well, because for our union, as Al said, we are not new to this space. To carbon capture, yes, because just over the last few years is when the effort really started to expand the 45Q tax credit to industrial sectors, so we're kind of a newbie to that space. But in terms of the overall conversation around climate, which really is the backdrop of this entire discussion that we're having today and tomorrow, we've really been a very active participant since 1968, when our union held its first really ever conference on clean air of any industrial union in the United States. And for us, it was the responsible thing to do, because our members work in sectors who, for all intents and purposes, are considered dirty, polluting sectors. And we felt that it was our responsibility as an international union to figure out policy mechanisms and drivers to help move these industries forward and make them operate more efficiently, with the ultimate goal of being more globally competitive. We were a very key part of the Clean Air Act development in 1970, again with the amendments in 1990, and then kind of forward and forward and forward and forward to where we are today. And we're proud of that. Al mentioned that we formed the Blue-Green Alliance with the Sierra Club. We're really proud of that work. We think it's important, not just environmentally, but economically, because there are so many opportunities that are presented in the work to try to mitigate the carbon emissions that plague our world now, not just our country. And you know, for us, I mentioned we're an industrial union. We have 850,000 members in the United States and Canada. We're the largest union in the steel sector, obviously, our name. Our largest sector, I bet no one can guess. Largest sector, what do you think? Anyone? Don't be shy. I will call on people that I don't know. Ben? Yeah, what do you think our largest sector is, despite our name? Good guess, Jason. We are the dominant union in the refining sector. No, we're not a building trades union. It's actually pulp and paper. Our largest sector is the pulp and paper sector. But we have members in pretty much every basic industry that you can imagine, going from steel to rubber to aluminum to glass to cement to refining. Pretty much every basic industry that you can imagine, we are there, fertilizers. And you know, so for us, being here a part of this conversation specifically on carbon mitigation technology is really, really key. And it goes to the point that Al mentioned in his opening remarks. The jobs that our members have in these sectors, we describe as the last best remaining jobs in this country. Our members who work at Philadelphia Energy Solutions in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at that refinery, they make over $100,000 a year. The average wage of our steel workers, roughly $80,000 and up. Our pulp and paper workers, roughly $85,000 and up. Pulp and paper in particular, they're working at facilities that are in very, very rural communities where they are it. They are the employer. That facility is the employer. And they're providing these jobs at really high wages, as Al said, with really great benefits. And those funds that are generated through that business operation go into the community. They help to make sure the schools remain open and functional, that there are resources like libraries, that the local roads and other infrastructure can be taken care of and funded in a way that is necessary for those communities. So it's not just the jobs that are on the site. There's a significant multiplier effect into other jobs and community resources. The last best remaining jobs in this country is how we describe them. And it is our responsibility as the steel workers, when it comes to our members in these sectors, to make sure that there's a path forward for them. And we talk about the economic sustainability of that path forward. And it takes a whole bunch of different things. There's a toolbox that we use to try to make sure that there is a room for these industries and our workers going forward. And one of those is making sure that these industries have the technologies that are available to make sure that they last into the future. 45Q right now, and you know, carbon capture technology for industries like steel and cement. At this point for us domestically, they're a little aspirational because we don't have any real project to point to domestically. But we feel like we'll get there. And 45Q is one tool in that toolbox, but we need a lot more tools like that to actually get there. Companies want to do it. My colleague from ArcelorMittal Steel is just like me, really excited about the potential that exists. And we're trying to make sure that we get there. And we appreciate forums like this where we have like-minded individuals who see that there is a role for industry going into our economic future. One of the things that really confounds us and has been confounding us over the last several years is the resistance that we have been meeting from some of our allies in the environmental community who push back on policies like 45Q for fear that they will wind up producing more oil, or carbon emissions will increase, or whatever the arguments are that come from our friends in that movement, confound us. Because for us, without technologies like this that actually take these industries into the future, there is no future for these industries. There is no future for the workers in these sectors. And so, it's a challenge that we have, I think, for us to educate our friends in these communities about why it is important to make sure that we have a steel industry in the year 2050. When we talk about our climate mitigation goals, we always have 2050 as kind of that date that's out there that we refer to when we talk about reducing emissions by that end date. In 2050, we want to make sure that we have a strong and vital and viable manufacturing sector in this country as well. We want to make sure that we're still creating good family-sustaining jobs as well. We want to make sure that we're still doing everything we can to promote strong and healthy and sustainable communities. And 45Q and other policies like it will hopefully help us to get there. So I'll stop my remarks there and kind of back to Al.
Okay. Thank you, Roxanne. Our third presenter is Shafe Shermer. And for those of you in the room, I think she is the greatest opportunity for you to ask real questions about what goes on inside of a coal gen plant, because that's what she does for a living. Roxanne and I approach this from a political and legislative perspective, but in Shafe's world, this is what she does. And I've had the great opportunity to take many legislative people and elected people, obviously, through the coal strip plant. And they all walk out, with their mouths kind of agape, like, man, that's an unbelievable facility. And I don't think everybody in this room who is approaching this issue has probably ever taken the time to go through a power plant or had the opportunity. So I'm going to turn it over to Shafe to talk about what it's like in a coal plant, generating plant in Wyoming. And I would encourage you, after her presentation, it'll be open for questions. This is a great opportunity. If you've never been to one, talk to somebody that makes their living in one. Go ahead, Shafe.
No pressure right now. Well, thank you for that introduction. As he said, my name is Shafe Shermer, and I am the Financial Secretary Treasurer for Utility Workers Local 127 here in Wyoming. Our local represents almost 550 members across most of the state of Wyoming, especially central and western Wyoming. We have 3 power plants that we represent. Jim Bridger Power Plant out of Point of Rocks, which is about 40 miles east of Rock Springs. The Dave Johnston Power Plant out of Glen Rock, Wyoming, about 30 miles east of Casper. And then also the Wyandotte Power Plant out of Gillette, Wyoming, near the integrative test facility that is obviously so exciting for this group today. In addition to our power plants, we also represent our linemen, our districtmen, the transmission department that takes the electricity that we generate and sends it down the line to all of the substations and to all of our businesses and homes. So obviously, finding a way to keep electric generation going is integral to our futures. As Al and Roxanne mentioned, this is literally my future we discussed today, but it's also my past, it's my history, it's in my blood. I was born and raised in Rock Springs, Wyoming. I graduated in 2000 from Rock Springs High School, very much a small, sleepy town, small town community. And I grew up in a middle class house to union parents, so union is also in my blood. After high school, I wanted to see the world. I wanted to see anything different than Wyoming, because when you live here and it's all you don't know how good it is. Rock Springs doesn't look as good as Jackson Hole, so if you travel through there, you'll get it. So I moved to Vegas for 10 years. I think I stayed for 10 years out of sheer stubbornness, but family called me home. My parents were still in Rock Springs. My brother and my nephews are in Rock Springs. So I was glad to move home. And 4 years ago, I was fortunate to be hired by Rocky Mountain Power to work at the Jim Bridger Power Plant. That's where I joined membership with Utility Workers Local 127. I was hired in an entry-level position as a clerk, an administrative assistant, essentially did payroll entry, and moved into quality for the state of Wyoming. I have to go through all the rigorous testing and requirements for that because we do provide all of our domestic water, all of our clean potable water for the plant as a community all day, every day while we're there. And then we also provide all of our boiler process water and cooling water. So I mentioned that this is also my history. While I've only been at the plant and with the local for 4 years, my parents both retired from there. My father retired as a mechanic in 2008, and my mother retired as a lab tech, so following in her footsteps in 2012. My brother is currently employed at the Jim Bridger Power Plant as an auxiliary operator. And so it is very much a family enterprise, and I can speak firsthand to the middle class life that we have enjoyed and the ability to retire with dignity that my parents currently enjoy in their retirement. Their pensions, health care up until that point, and all of those benefits, all of the generous time off that our local fights for has provided that life that I know and that I hope more people continue to know in America. The discussion about carbon capture is obviously central to Wyoming. I mean, what a better backdrop. Like I said, Rock Springs doesn't look anything like Jackson, but we do still enjoy robust outdoor lifestyle. There is plenty of public open land with open access for any multiple use that anyone can think of. There is camping and hunting and fishing, and those are the things I grew up doing and enjoy. It's few other commutes. While it is a 40-mile commute to work every day, a few other commutes include pronghorn antelope, elk, and deer along the roadside, bald eagles, an abundance of wildlife that actually cohabitate our plant sites right along with us. So like Roxanne said, it isn't this, or it is no longer this dirty industry. Our union and our company work hand in hand to be stewards of our safety as well as environmental stewards for the entire area around us. So I think, Roxanne and Al definitely spoke to a lot of the reasons why we feel this is important for our industries. But that's my personal story, why this is integral for my future and what it could mean for us down the line.
Thank you, Shafe. I talk about why it's important, but I also think I'd like to speak to the fact that it's very doable. And as I said, I live in a political world. But Colin Marshall and I met through the Governor Bullock, almost 3 years ago now, Colin? Now, he's the CEO of a non-union coal mining company, and I'm the head of a state labor federation. And I didn't go into my background, but trust me, I've been union all my life. And my mother and father would probably come back to haunt me if I chose a different path. But Colin and I found a whole bunch of things we had in common around this issue. And we also found out that we had the ability to speak to different people. And I think that's really the important part of this, is the ability to speak to different people, because everybody in this room needs to reach out and talk to folks about this. And it's unfortunate that people in the room were not aware that labor had been involved on this issue. That's a lot on us, because we tend to take our own paths, but we need to figure out how to do this together, and I do believe it's doable. But I would open it up to any questions. They're going to run a mic over to you, and there's.
Hi, Alan. Could you elaborate on, you say, what is the doable path? Is it carbon capture? If it's carbon capture, what's the impediment to it not having happened? or what are the things that need to happen to make it happen? If it's something other than carbon capture, is it some sort of regulatory relief? What is the, when you say it's doable, give us a vision of where you'd like to see things go so that the importance of the values you described can be preserved.
Well, excuse me, I might have just hit puberty at 60 when my voice went up. But I'm not going to speak to the technology because probably almost every person in this room is better qualified than I am to speak to the technology involved. I'd speak to the will. And I think that, you know, whether it is CCS or CCUS, it's a matter of will and necessity, because I'm trying to think of the presenter that talked about there's 110 gigawatts of energy under development, coal energy and fossil fuel energy. I think it was just coal in this planet. We need to communicate to the environmental community a much stronger message that the path forward is the path we're talking about here. It's all, I mean, it cannot be that our solution is to eliminate coal generation in the United States and think we accomplished something, because we didn't accomplish anything. We simply need to find the coalitions, and I think that this group that was brought together today helps us build that forward. And it's going to, my personal opinion, and my father would be the first one to tell you that my opinion's not worth much, but is that it's going to be driven by policy. If you look at that plant right there, the Clean Power Plan, it's met every goal that has ever been put forward under federal policy. Now it needs to be incentivized, and I think there was also people here more qualified talking about how we incentivize that. That's the things I'm learning. But we need to find will, and we need to pass policy. I mean, 45Q is huge, in my mind, because it starts us on a path, not just because of what it accomplishes, but it starts us on a conversation with electeds who will make policy to understand that the path to saving this planet is through carbon capture, carbon utilization, new technology, and moving this whole agenda forward.
Al, if I can just add to that, our panel this morning had kind of a common theme among each of the innovators that sat up here and talked about what they saw as ramifications of waste and how to take that waste and create it into something new. And I think what really has to be in our minds is that we can't forget about the waste that is created with our human capital. When we churn industry, when we steamroll through changes without consideration of all of the capital involved, that's when we see entire communities devastated. That's when we see plants in Ohio shut down, and in Massachusetts. That's when we see Colstrip have units shuttered and people face an uncertain future. And that's when you see people take drastic measures to try and preserve their way of life that they know. When we forget to consider the people that work these industries and where it leaves them to completely change the face of our power grid or our energy sector, we take for granted all the investment in those folks, in my parents and in myself. We have to remember that it's not just carbon that is waste, it's not just chemicals that are waste. We can't let people become waste too.
And if I could just add on to Showface's really, really powerful and important point, not to talk politics, but that's what we saw in 2016. If I'm going to be very honest can I be honest with this room? Can we keep things secret?
No.
My membership, the vast majority of my membership does not look like me. I'm the new face of the steelworkers. But, speaking seriously, in 2016, roughly 55% of my members voted for Donald Trump. And they did that because of exactly what Shofei just said. This is not power sector related in terms of my membership, but the loss of jobs and the human capital that was captured in the loss. Communities that were devastated, and a perception that there's no one looking out for them. So in this energy space, it's the exact same feeling. There's no one looking out for your members who may lose their job because of a power plant closing, or my members who may lose jobs because they work on a barge in Kentucky transporting coal from the mine to the power plant, and they're worried that they're gonna lose their job on the barge because of policies. So we're in a really tricky time, and we have to figure out how to talk about these things in a really pragmatic way that doesn't lose the human capital. They have to be able to see themselves in what we're talking about. This coalition, and Brad, you know, truly my hat's off to you, because you've really pulled together a coalition that has the potential to really figure out how to talk about this in a way that you can go to Ohio, you can go to West Virginia, you can go to Kentucky, and you can speak to the policymakers in that state, but you can also go to a plant represented by the utility workers or by the steel workers, go check out my guys on the barges, and they will actually hear what you have to say. Julio was here, and you know, back during the Clean Power Plan, we actually had to do an internal educational piece for our members, because we actually do have members in the power sector, a small amount. We brought them into DC because we needed to explain to them what this policy was, because they were scared to death about where they were gonna fall if the CPP went forward. And we brought Julio in. Do you remember that, Julio? You came into our office, and it had been a very antagonistic meeting before you came. They were frustrated. They were wondering what the hell our union was doing, even potentially supporting something like this. And you came in and you talked to them about CCUS. You pulled up the map. You showed the potential. You talked about 45Q, and at that point, I mean, it was a pipe dream whether or not it was really gonna happen, right? It was years ago. And they felt hopeful, because they actually saw a policy that could help preserve their livelihood. That's how we have to talk to people. If we don't want a repeat of 2016 and the travesties that have ensued since then, we need to figure out how to use the very pragmatic messages that are coming out of this room and this discussion and present them in a way that is attractive to people so that they see themselves. They don't want to see words on a paper and policy. They want to see themselves in what we're talking about. They want to see their families. They want to see their communities. We have to break out of the policy wonky mode that we sometimes get in and just and make it real for people.
Other questions?
Yeah, my name's Matt Baker. I'm with the Hewlett Foundation. As I look at, and I share your concerns about kind of where the green groups are at. I actually come from that background myself, but I also think there are lessons to be learned kind of where we're at with the debate right now and how to move forward on that. And if you look at what the renewables advocates basically did, at some point the production tax credit was established. The price of particularly wind turbines came, maybe twice as much as conventional power. And I think that's not that different from where we are right now. But then what happened was they went to a whole bunch of states, starting with really just a couple of states, and said, hey, let's figure out a mechanism that will allow us to basically apply 1% of all electricity sales to developing these projects. Some of them were RPSs, some of them were other systems benefits charges and things like that. And it seems to me that now we're at that point where really we should be finding some places that want to be leaders And policymakers, I was a former regulator too, so I'm not asking regulators to approve a 1% increase in sales. It's over the pay grade. But really start to do that. Like let's, you know, it's in my, I feel like it's up to, you know, this is you know, when I was doing renewable advocacy, we would go to farming communities who were interested in the tax benefits that would come from these electricity facilities. But it seems that in any event, we're at the point where now there can be more state initiatives that are really about trying to, through relatively small amounts of money that are committed by either ratepayers or state coffers or royalties or things like that, that we can actually start putting resources into these programs. And I think that's the necessary prerequisite for all of this to happen. I don't think there's going to be that much more federal action that will incentivize it. And besides, the real incentives needs to be somebody who's going to buy the power that's coming from these projects. So I just, being people who are politically motivated or politically in tune, I should say, and who very much operate at the state level, what are the opportunities for that in places like Montana or Wyoming or even some of the neighboring states?
I guess this is where the pressure's on again. No, you know, I can't speak to the specifics of what our state can do today. That is above my pay grade. But obviously hosting a conference such as this gets the conversation going. As previous speakers have said, take this message and spread it far and wide. This is the face of what we can take forth, what I can take back to my membership who felt disenfranchised and say, this is what our national union with a coalition of people like Brad Crabtree and the Great Plains Institute are working on to make sure that our plants remain profitable while still fitting tighter regulatory requirements for environmental impacts. And we can meld that together into a longer term future, which means stability. You know, we talk about what happens if a plant closes down. I'm young enough and I don't have all my eggs in one basket. I haven't worked at a power plant for almost 20 years since I graduated from high school, like many people have, like my family did. I have customer service and sales background and I would probably land on my feet. I'd probably be able to find another sector, although it wouldn't be at an income that would allow me to buy a house like I did for the first time this year. It wouldn't allow me the type of stable income that I have now for the last 4 years. But for a lot of people who know this plant, know these plants and this industry, to just change that scape, it's not as easy for them. And like Roxanne talked about, it leaves communities without libraries, without schools funded. I think Wyoming's already on the path. Governor Mead and Montana's governor have organized this and hosted this to help bring this forth, but we all take the message from here to make it happen.
So I can speak to Montana. We're like a lot of states, and we face that dilemma of having a significant shortage of revenue. So I don't think it would be something we could move legislatively, and I think, I guess the way I can frame Montana is I'm a labor leader, and I have, and I don't care if you take this back to Montana, but I have 15 Democrats that if I could primary them and beat them, I'd take them out. And there's about the same percentage of Republicans. And so we operate right in the middle. Unfortunately, there's not enough capacity in the middle to move most positive legislation. The idea of bringing it up through the regulatory system is something, quite honestly, I never thought about. It's kind of interesting to me, and how that would play out, I don't know. Now, what I can tell you that is really positive is around the coal strip issue in Montana is for the first time, as we have looked at legislation that would address some of the impacts of the closure of 1 and 2 and potential closure of 3 and 4, in the next 10 to 15 years, there were environmental groups who came forward and supported those efforts, which really hadn't been a partnership that had been in play for us before. Now, there were also environmental groups that went out and literally opposed this, legislation that, they were working from the perspective that if and I know there's owners and CEOs and people that represent business, but the idea that some of the ramifications after literally taking billions of dollars of profit out of Colstrip, that some of that should come back to the community to help them mitigate the impacts that were going on. And there were environmental groups that stood up and said, oh, that's bad for business. They won't come here and build wind if you guys pass this legislation. But it was interesting. It was the first time I've really seen a crack in the environmental community where half of them were coming forward and supporting legislation. And then there was a group, quite honestly, the group that had litigated the closure of 1 and 2 that came forward and said, well, this is bad for business. We can't do it here. So I'm seeing a change. I think the reason I bring that specific example forward, is because I'm seeing a change in leadership and a lot of different organizations around this specific issue of how we address carbon in the atmosphere. We have 2 minutes and 16 seconds left if anybody wants to. I know I spoke over my 7, so nobody thought I was actually looking at the clock, but
Do you have a question up here? Or?
My name is Richard Garrett. I'm from Lander, Wyoming, and I work for the Nature Conservancy. And I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for joining this coalition. Roxanne, you got a little bit of work to do. There's not a union bug on my tablet.
We can work on that.
But it's good to know where the electrons that heat my house come from. And I'll tell you, you can see over the edge of the earth from Glasgow because I lived there.
Anybody else?
Quickly, Rob.
I don't know how quick this is, but you can do what you want with this one. I'm just wondering if the conversations you've all had or with folks in the environmental community, and of course that community is not monolithic, but I'm wondering if you've explicitly had a conversation about whether or not the enemy here, and I put that in quotes, whether or not the enemy here is coal or the enemy is carbon. Have you had that conversation explicitly with people? Because it feels like that's sort of that's burbling underneath this whole conversation, is whether we're focused on reducing carbon or whether or not we need to get rid of coal or fill in the blank.
So, and I'll just briefly respond, in the context of the Blue Green Alliance and at our table, we've talked about, we've raised it in a different way. Clearly there's a lot of frustration on the part of energy unions with the keep it in the ground conversation. Because we feel that during the Waxman-Markey time and debate, there was a very clear focus on mitigating emissions of carbon dioxide. And there was a unified effort with a whole bunch of key stakeholders who understood that that was the goal. And then things shifted, and it shifted more to your point, projects and just keeping energy sources in the ground, period. And we've talked about how that's not a healthy conversation, because in that shift, we've lost people who were their stakeholders during the Waxman-Markey exercise, who now feel that the world is against them because the conversation is now about the war on coal versus the war on saving our frickin' planet, right? That's not where we want to be. So we're trying to have those conversations. To be very, very honest with you, there are some that are moving further and further left. And it's not helpful.
So we are out of time, and I appreciate the questions. I'd be glad to talk with any of you. I'll add I think it became a war on coal, and once the war on coal gets over, it'll be a war on petroleum products. And quite honestly, there's some environmental organizations, and some maybe might be in the room, but from where I look at you, it's become a fundraising model for you. And I came out of fundraising and campaigns, and that's what I do for my labor movement. It's a model that works, but it's not a model that's healthy for our planet. Thank you.
Thank you.